Updated. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for coming to this webinar session brought to you by BELTA. My name is James Taylor, and I am the president of BELTA, the Belgian English Language Teachers Association. Our aim is to encourage professional development through bringing English language professionals in Belgium together to discuss the things that matter to them, whether it's face-to-face or online. In our Sunday with BELTA webinar series, we are connecting BELTA teachers to the wider world of ELT by bringing our members together with teachers from around the world to watch presentations from international speakers. So hello to all our members and everyone in Belgium, and to those of you joining us from outside Belgium. In this month's webinar, we are joined by Andrew Walkley. Andrew has almost 25 years experience as a teacher, trainer and materials writer. His current coursebook series is Outcomes, published by National Geographic, and as a trainer he's interested in getting teachers to engage more with language and getting closer to meeting the students' language needs and wants. He's the co-founder of Lexical Lab, a company promoting excellence in lexical materials and teaching, and alongside Hugh Deller, one of our plenary speakers at our BELTA Day this year. You can look at their new website, lexicallab.com. I highly recommend it. So his talk today is called Language Focused Teacher Development, and it will look at how creating language-rich classrooms is demanding on teachers, and he'll suggest how teachers develop their language awareness on an ongoing basis. Okay, so thanks very much for joining us today, Andrew, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, James. Right, well, I'm going to, unfortunately, I bet you weren't expecting this on a Sunday afternoon, but I'm actually going to make you work for a couple of moments. So the first thing we're going to do is, if you have a look at these words here, and in each group of words, group of 4 words, can you put those 4 words in order of frequency? So the most frequent word in English is used the most times to the least frequent word. Okay, and for each of those groups of 4, put them in order. You don't have to write it up on the chat box or anything. You can just do it on a piece of paper or just in your head, as you wish. Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes just to think about it, or 30 seconds. Whole massive typing thing going on there. Good to see. Well done, John. Okay. While you're typing, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to answer my door. 1 second. Yeah, no, it's okay. Okay. I'm back. Right then. Okay, you can stop there to see how we get on in a moment. Okay, because I've got another task for you next. See what this comes up with. Okay. This case, you have 2 minutes to write an example of these words and the structure. So when I say past continuous, I don't mean using the word past continuous in a sentence. I mean using was going, was doing, whatever in a sentence. Okay, so you just have to write 8 sentences that you might write to your students if a student asked you what these words mean. Okay, again, you don't have to put it in the chat box if you don't want to. You can write it down or think about it. Give you a couple of minutes. Very amusing, Mr. Dan. Comfort from Spain. Yes. Yes, I was giving a talk when someone knocked at the door. It was my family. Couldn't leave them on the doorstep. Okay, I'll give you all 30 seconds more. It doesn't matter if you don't finish all of them. At least kind of just think about what you might write. Well done, Mr. Edge UK, who managed to combine all words in one sentence. Very impressive. I think at this point, perhaps we should move on, and I shall come back to. Right, there we go. Another one from Bozidar Nikic. Yeah, putting them all together. So the idea was to actually write an example of each of the words. There was my idea. Okay, right. Let us move on. You can stop further typing at this point. No more need for further examples. I'll come back to these points in 1 second. Okay. First, I'm going to explain a little bit about where the idea of this talk came from. I suppose basically over the last 20, 30 years, I mean, we've had mainly this, what we call communicative language teaching, but within that, I think we've seen some particular types of approaches which we could describe as language rich on the one hand and responsive. So in other words, what we're expecting teachers to do is to set up tasks in the case of task-based learning, or conversations in the case of dogme, where students talk and do the task and the teacher listens for where there are gaps in knowledge, where the students have, in task-based learning, the idea is if there's a breakdown in the communication, this is a moment where learning takes place. The teacher can facilitate the learning, teaching them the new language, and then maybe in the case of dogme, they might do some further practice together. Task-based learning is a little less clear on that. Similarly, I think with, I don't know if anybody's heard of this idea of demand high teaching. It's something, it's actually what's really sparked this talk, which was a talk by Jim Scrivener, where he was kind of complaining that a lot of teaching taking place in the world, in his context, I think it's mainly English language teaching within Britain, within these kind of CELTA-trained native speaker teachers, where he saw a lot of good management. So the teachers would set up the task, students would do the task, we'd have lots of answers, and then we'd move on to the next task, and the next task, and the next task. And his idea was that essentially there wasn't much teaching happening, that the teacher needed to be stronger in, for example, saying, no, it's wrong, or pushing individual students to teach them in the moment where they were struggling, etc. And his kind of, a lot of his solutions were, I I perceived as technical, kind of technique type of thing. So he would, for example, suggest that you know, the teacher might pretend not to understand what the student is saying, so forcing them to explain why they thought it was right or wrong, or they would act as devil's advocate. So student offers an answer, the teacher says, "Are you sure about that?" forcing them to explain a little bit more and engage with the class. Well, I think that's okay to a point, but for me, I felt that it wasn't the real reason why the teaching wasn't happening. And as somebody who's been interested in the lexical approach since its publication 20 years ago now, I've also been aware that the expectation of thinking about language and dealing with language, which the lexical approach advocated, is difficult. And while I was thinking of all these things, I read shortly afterwards this book. It's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman is an economist. He's a psychologist, I suppose, actually. And he won a Nobel Prize for economics. And one of his, what the book's about is the difficulty of experts actually really employing their expertise. Because what he says that often what happens is there are two types of thinking. We have a kind of fast, in the moment, spontaneous thinking, which is an important part of our lives. He's not suggesting that we shouldn't have this. But what happens in those moments is that rather than think clearly about certain aspects of thinking, we replace a kind of logical thoughts with what he calls heuristics, which is a kind of bias. So it's a kind of generalized idea of something. And I'll explain that in a second as we go through. Okay, so this brings us back to the task we just did. Now, these are the frequency numbers based on the British National Corpus. It's available from phrasesinenglish.org, sorry, it's this one here. The numbers are number of occurrences per million words in the corpus. Now, there was a question here, frequency in what context, from Lizzie Pinnard. And the answer to that would be that the frequency of the BNC is essentially both written and spoken. But I think we would have to say there is a bias towards written English rather than spoken. The question is then, is this bias reflective of actually our, a native speaker's actual use of language? Because it's quite possible that we read, hear language. I mean, you think about reading the radio or the television. I mean, these are essentially written, so often they sound like spoken English, but they are kind of written forms, written down. They're scripted in some way or other. So there's an issue there, and I think we need to bear that in mind. What's interesting, though, is how many of you got the actual order correct. My feeling is that often we overestimate certain frequencies of words and underestimate others. So I guess the idea here would be, thank you for Daniel, by the way, he goes to the 90% written, 10% spoken. So it is, it's going to be more towards written. But having said that, what we need to think about is if we take arise and beard, for example, now clearly we may imagine beard will be more of an occurrence in spoken language than arise, but in fact within the spoken element of the corpus, arise and beard are basically at a similar level. And we have to think about how far our students now, so many of them are interested in professional and academic lives in English, you know, where they may not necessarily be using the language all the time in their workplace. They may not go and study in Britain, but a lot of their studies may use English language textbooks, etc. And it's something which has I've slightly started to change my mind about, in part from dealing with a lot of academic English at the university where I used to work. I'll talk a little bit more about why some of these words in a second, why some of them may be kind of overly, we might overestimate their frequency. I mean, I was fortunate to see some of your examples, and you know, apart from Ed, whose magnificent effort in combining all of them, our often tendency is to produce examples like he's an ambitious businessman, he has a beard, she is Christian, or I was having a bath when the phone rang. What I would suggest is that sometimes these aren't actually the most common uses and the way we use these language. I was looking in the, again, it's in the BNC for an example of he, she is a Christian, and as with thousands, there was one example. And in fact, if you do a search, you can do a search, she is a Christian. I think it was actually one example in the whole corpus. So how are we actually using Christian is my question here. That often it may be used as an adjective more often, perhaps. Okay, there may be more complex sentences that we might use, and my suggestion may be that a few of you might have, certainly I would, in a normal circumstances, I might one second, struggle with some of these. Let me just find it. Sorry. Yeah, perhaps some of these ones, such as you know, whereby, arise, criticism, in terms of. Some of these are more difficult to think of examples from, especially on the spot, because basically I don't think they fit into that simple X is Y pattern. They're actually, they require more complex sentences. So if we kind of think about this in terms of, you know, these might be the more complex sentences we'd have. These ones I came up with. Government faced a lot of criticism because of the education policy. We got these kind of, you know, they're all kind of complex sentences. You know, we could use arise. Sometimes you might use come up instead of arise. Obviously, in spoken language, maybe similarly common. This is from a program which was on recently. It's difficult to think of these examples just on the spot. And the Daniel Kahneman book gives some very clear reasons why it might be difficult. And it's to do with these biases that overtake more logical thought. So, for example, if any of you had, for example, arise or banana, you know, banana, beard, perhaps higher up the store, supermarket, perhaps. There's a tendency for us to put these higher up because we can think of we can more quickly think of an example of someone who is blonde, or somebody who has a beard, or someone who, or picturing a banana, than we can for examples of arise, or whereby, or paramedic perhaps. So instead of thinking actually, but if we think about the number of different contexts we use banana or arise, then it quickly becomes clear that arise can appear in obviously in lots of texts, might be in more academic texts, but also matters arising in meetings. If that arises, we can sort it out. So there are several more possible contexts for the word arise than there are for the word banana or beard. I mean, similarly, serious compared to fun, sometimes it's basically there are a wider number of things which can be serious, I suppose, than there are fun things, sadly. Okay, if we just go back. Pardon me. Okay, the representational bias, this is this idea of if you ask somebody to describe a doctor, very typically they will have a representation of what a doctor is. Man, unfortunately, white coats, stethoscope around his neck, etc. Okay, and what I would think is, in some ways, the representation of English is X is Y. X does Y. So often the words which we come to mind and the examples that we want to give are often of that nature. They are come quicker to mind than if we thought more carefully about how we might use them. And then the last one, priming. Priming is Kahneman gives an example right at the beginning, a rather unpleasant example of someone of saying the word vomit, and he says that as soon as you say this word, there are very small changes that we don't notice, but we might begin to slightly sweat more, mouth goes a little bit drier, slightly faster heart palpitations. There are kind of physical responses to the word because we've been kind of primed to connect those two things together. And in English language teaching, that priming is quite strong, I think, as is the example of I was having a bath when the phone rang. We had a better example in our one, but it's a basic was doing, this happened. And it's often somebody arriving or phoning or something along those lines. That's fine, but also beyond that, sometimes I think we because of what we've learned before and what we've seen in course books before, etc., we think of certain examples and typical contexts, and we don't see the wider context that we could use. But it also, I think, is a problem because sometimes when we are trying to hear what students are saying and trying to correct them, often what we are primed to notice is basic grammar, typical grammar that we have taught before. So it will very commonly be notice the present perfect or the missed third person S, or these kinds of things, and those are things we look to correct. Now that is a little bit problematic as far as I'm concerned in terms of these kind of responsive methodologies, because basically there's a big cognitive load for any teacher who's trying to do these methods. So basically, when you're listening, when you're in class, I mean, the idea of task-based learning is you do this with, is that we're catering for individuals. And when you think about what you have to do, you have to hear the student first, which in many classrooms is quite difficult actually, because you have to get round, physically laid out classrooms which are difficult to get round. There may be a lot of talking. So first you have to hear the students. You have to understand what they want to say, or obviously if they're writing, what they want to write. You then have to recognize the error or the gap in their language. Then you're going to have to give the correct example. I put correct in quotation marks here, because sometimes I think what we want to be doing is to extend students' knowledge. So they may be repeatedly using a simple word where actually either it's equally common or more common to use a slightly, say, a phrasal verb or some other kind of less frequently used word. We then have to explain, ideally, if the student's going to learn, explain or check why one is incorrect and the other is correct. If we're talking in terms of, I think task-based and dogma are similar in the sense that they would suggest giving extra examples of this new language. Some are, again, I'm not sure task-based necessarily recommends further practice, but certainly dogma in the writings I've seen from sorry, my brain, Scott Thornbury and Luke Meddings, they've suggested you might do a spontaneous practice on this thing, and then if we want the students to recall it, particularly if it's vocabulary, we need to remember it in order to revise it and practice it at a later date. So that's a lot to expect, and a lot even more to expect if you're going to do that with individual students. And I think actually that is what happens, is very typically we can't deal with it. And what we'll do in class is either go back onto what we were saying we knew before, we've taught before, examples we've given before, or we give relatively infrequent words sometimes, so we might focus on the bananas of the English language rather than the arises of the English language, and we might give simplified examples which don't necessarily reflect enough of how those words are used. And if you're a believer in kind of more lexical type of approach to language and teaching, one of the important things is giving examples, good examples of how language is used. So that is a big issue then, I think, for these kind of methodologies. That we tend to focus on errors that we've been primed to notice, typically verb phrases and simple errors. We'll focus and exemplify things we've seen or taught ourselves before. And interestingly, for somebody who doesn't like course books, for example, often they will be the examples that they've seen in a course book sometime before. Course book writers are similarly primed. So unfortunately, I'm conscious that I sometimes do it myself. You really have to, you come up with examples which just, afterwards you think, well, what was I thinking? Nobody would ever say that. So, we will tend towards things which we've seen in books before. If you believe that the lexics and exemplifying natural use is important, we need to attend to it, I think, outside the class. And this is the key thing for me in terms of language-focused teacher development. To do it inside the class is very difficult because of this cognitive load. And that actually what we need to be doing is thinking much more about how examples we might give, questions we might ask, etc. about, for example, language which is in the course book. So it may be that actually to become a better non-coursebook user, at first we need to become better coursebook users. I know it seems slightly paradoxical, but hopefully we will see some ideas of this as we're going on. Just that a little bit in red there. Just as an example of this, I don't know if any of you know Hugh Deller, who's my colleague. I think sometimes he gave an example of a lesson he'd done where somebody had asked for the difference between heaven and hell. And he'd given some responses to this. Then they'd had a discussion about religion, and then had a discussion about little kind of dialogues between whether you're religious, are you religious at all, and responses to this. And it looked quite a spontaneous, clever lesson, and I would say it was, of course, because he's a friend of mine. But I know that, for example, that in the writing that we've done, there was an exercise we did on heaven and hell, and vocabulary connects with that. We also had an exercise on little dialogues with are you religious or not, and typical responses. So actually a lot of the language which he was dealing with, some of it, a little bit of it, was completely new, I think. But a lot of it was actually something which he'd taught before, and that basically he just got a new kind of primed order of doing these things. So the idea is, I think, is the more of these kind of steps that we have in our teaching, the more we focus on different words and how we might exemplify them, and ask questions about them and think about spontaneous practices for them, apparently spontaneous practices, the more we will get better at doing it spontaneously. And one of the kind of last thing about the Daniel Kahn book is he suggests, for example, the example of chess players who basically learn lots and lots and lots and lots of moves. I think I don't know if it's the 10,000 hours he refers to, but it's that kind of amount of practice that it takes them to become spontaneous within the context of a chess match. Now, we might not have so much time to prepare over our lives, but the point is, it's an ongoing process. And if we start doing it more from the beginning, I think we would get better at dealing with it with language as we go along. So, yeah, in terms of training and development, then I would suggest that perhaps to begin with, I don't know about your training experience, but certainly I did 1 month CELTA courses followed by a diploma. Most of that the language focus on those courses was essentially verb phrases, tenses, and relatively little on lexis and how lexis and grammar often kind of work together. They were still dominated by an idea that we have grammar rules and we slot in words, which I don't particularly agree with. In terms of the planning, I think both in terms of on those training courses and after I was first trained, I think a lot of my planning focused on activities, new activities, thinking of activities to help practice bits of grammar or vocabulary within the course book or which I'd planned to teach. what I would suggest is we need to think a lot more about how the Lexis works, thinking of examples, thinking of questions to ask about this Lexis as a focus for our planning, rather than necessarily thinking lots more practice. I think in terms of observation, when I've seen teachers teach, and when I've been asked to present, to produce lesson plans for inspections by organisations like the British Council or the like, there was very much a focus on fulfilling aims, which were basically, the idea was, well, I'm going to teach these words, this grammar, and the judgment on the lesson was based on fulfilling those aims. Well, I think that sometimes is going against an idea of being responsive to students. And if we want teachers to be more responsive to what students, listening to what they're trying to say, we not only have to think about how we're training to think about language, but we also need to take that through into the way we observe teachers and our expectations of what a good lesson is. And that might mean simply saying, was there some new language taught? Is that a better criteria? Was that useful new language taught? If you want to add some further criteria to it. And in a way, it doesn't especially matter necessarily where that language came from. There may be an issue about whether it's sufficient, those kinds of issues, but it's trying to incorporate our criteria of observing teachers in the way alongside the training we give. And then in teacher development, my experience has been essentially learning new techniques, and this is one of the reasons I found the demand high kind of lecture, where they want people to respond to students more, a little bit frustrating, because it was more techniques. It was this kind of, there is other ways of doing something, whereas I feel that we need to be focused a little bit more on the actual language, noticing what language is in the course books, because there's lots of it that doesn't necessarily fit into the traditional canon of grammar and vocabulary, and lots in reading texts, in vocabulary and grammar exercises, and in obviously in what students say. And we could do more teacher development around those issues. So here are some possible kind of exercise we might do in terms of teacher development. The first one I'm not going to go through particularly, because you have the links there. You can click on them now if you want. But these are all examples of frequency training. The first one is from the Macmillan Dictionary. It's basically a little game. You have to decide if it's a 3-star word, which is in the top 2,500, 2-star, top 5,000 words, and the last one is the 1-star, is top 7,500 words. And it just gives you, it's just kind of training in thinking about, well, seeing if you understand what is most frequent. But I think the most important thing is, once you realize that it's very frequent, thinking about why it's frequent, and as a consequence, thinking about the type of examples we might give to reflect that frequency. Because, for example, if we go back to the ambitious businessman or the ambitious man, we tend to lose the idea that it's very frequent because we have ambitious plans and ambitious schemes and these kinds of ambitions, ambitious lesson. I've had quite a few overly ambitious lessons in my time. Though we may be missing those elements. The complete lexical tutor is a similar kind of thing, but it's a little bit more complex. You have to put them in different groups And the last one is phrasesinenglish.org, which I personally find the easiest to manage. It's the British National Corpus. You put in a word or a couple of words. You can request that it's the exact word or the same lemma. In other words, you might get the plural or a past participle form included. And it just gives you a rough count of the words in the English language with a concordance, which you can have set up to 1,000. So you can see lots and lots of examples of how it's used. And through that, you can see sometimes where there's the figure may skew things a little bit. So if we went back to the Christian one, yes, it's 68, but first it includes quite a few Christian names: Christian Slater, Christian Dorr, Christian Lacroix. Also Christian organisations, Christian Aid. Quite a lot, but still not as many as you might imagine. But it gives you an idea of how you can how common words are, and you might just take this as a staff room thing if you're reading something or you're trying to think of a collocation. Sad, I know it is, but this is something that Hugh and I have done over many years. It's just kind of have competitions to see who thinks it's more common. So is ambitious plan more common than ambitious man, for example? And then we'll have a little Google search where we'll put it between quotation marks, and we'll find out which is more common. It's a little thing to help us think about frequency. It's an ongoing task. The next thing is to think about, is basically the main bit I will be talking about in terms of teacher development and planning and thinking about these things. We don't have time to look at texts and other things like that. It's basically thinking about vocabulary exercises. Essentially, vocabulary exercises, a lot of them are just single words. Increasingly, you get now collocation exercises. So you get words, matching two words to make a collocation. And then you might have whole sentence exercises where there's a gap fill usually. Sometimes you might have a little dialogue where they match a question and a response, or a comment and a response. And I think what we could do is think about slightly different ways of what we need to do with each of these types of exercise. So on a single word exercise, on the basic thing, we should be thinking about what collocations to give or elicit from the students for each of these words. We might also be thinking about questions to ask about that vocabulary. And these aren't just meaning-focused ones. It's about usage, as we'll see in a moment. With a collocation exercise, in a way, collocation has become, oh, well, we've given them a collocation, that's enough. In a way, we need to now start thinking beyond that. So we want to kind of think about the collocation, the collocates of the collocations. Can we think of example sentence or little dialogues based on those collocations? Is there a story that we could tell or get the students to say based around one or other of those collocations? And then if we think about the whole sentence exercises, we might think of, this is an idea from a book called Messaging by George Woolard, available online. It's basically thinking before and after sentences. So you kind of create a text out of the example that they have. We could be asking questions and getting students to notice grammar or reusable chunks within those sentences, and other vocabulary which perhaps isn't the focus of the textbooks exercise, but maybe because it's more frequent or because it's just interesting and useful, and maybe the students still don't know it, that we could exploit. So let's have a look at some of these ideas quickly. So the single word exercise, this one was from a book. They had to decide which was the odd one out, which one isn't possible. I mean, actually, I think re-erect probably is possible, as in recopy is probably possible as well. But these were the answers which were required from the textbook. The temptation is, for many of us, is just to say they basically mean the same. So rebuild, reconstruct, remake, they're very similar. But are they? And what do the students get beyond adding re? So, which is the focus of the exercise. So the exercise is actually, the practice after this is that they have to add, think of more words or find more words where they can add re to them as a prefix. What I want to think about is how we can use these words more. So if we think of rebuild and reconstruct, remake, what collocations go with those words? Go on, just reconsider. What do you reconsider? Is it the same as what we re-examine or what we rethink? Is the same thing that we redraft the same thing that we reword or rewrite? Just have a think about that. So if anybody's got any suggested collocations, please add them. Go on, give you 30 seconds or a minute or so. Yes, I like your example, Joris. I've had to rethink many exercises in my time. Okay, you're getting. We've got enough here just to work with in a way, because if you think about the point is rebuild a relationship, perfect. Reconstruct a relationship, remake a relationship. We reconsider a decision. Maybe we re-examine a decision? What about re-examine the evidence? Do we rethink the evidence? We might rewrite an essay, reword an essay, maybe. But I think we'd reword our answer or something shorter usually. Etc. etc. Remake, we don't rebuild a film, we don't reconstruct a film. Reconstruct a situation, we might think about what particular situations that we reconstruct. So very typically we might reconstruct the scene of a crime or reconstruct a crime. As Ellie mentioned, so I've got my glasses, so I can't read your name fully. Ellie, we should have a rethink. So using these as nouns may be more common than the verbs sometimes. These are the kind of things we want to be able to tell our students if we're going to do them, but we might not. For example, I can't, for me, it doesn't seem right to reword an essay and rewrite an essay. But what is it that we reword, and trying to think of the precise examples, the precise way of the precise kinds of situation that we reconstruct, because often it's a bit like the example we had of supermarket. Supermarket is, one reason we might overestimate its frequency is partly because of we can all think of supermarkets, but often when we when we say I'm going to the supermarket, we often don't say I'm going to the supermarket. We say I'm going to Sainsbury's, I'm going to Lidl, I'm going to Mercadona, I'm going to Consum, whatever, the name of the place. And perhaps these are better examples for our students in some ways. So similarly, if we're going to reconstruct a situation, what is the kind of situation we might want to give? So it's thinking a little bit more about it in those ways. Okay, very simple. I mean, I'm sure lots of these things you do already, but I think the point is they're difficult to do on the spot. We do need to be able to think about them beforehand. This is it's not the best collocation exercise, but this is one I wrote very recently. So what you might think here is, what are the collocates of the collocations? So what do we say with swimming pool, tennis courts or tennis racket, running shoes, football pitch? What words? And we might think of adjectives, verbs that go with these compound nouns, essentially. Are there any example sentences or little dialogues which we could give to help students use these things? Because what happens for a coursebook writer, these things are very easy to write, because basically you just match them up. Sometimes you might have a picture, and for the coursebook writer, that's the job done. But for the language user, they need to see how we thank you, Adi Rajan, reword a question. Okay, thank you. How would we use these words? Go on, have a little go at that one. See if you can come up with any ideas there. God, you're good at this. Very good. My talk is maybe not required. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, I think without all of these things, I mean, the examples we have here are fine. We might, I mean, just as a second question you might ask is, who would you say it to, when you would say it, why would you say it? So, I mean, I particularly like Lizzie's one at the end. I'll see you on the track in half an hour. One can imagine the dialogue. One can imagine the previous prompt and the follow-up prompt. We might, is there anywhere to go running around here? Well, there's a track down the road, for example. So one might, if you can think of these, how they might work within a dialogue, I think it's all the better, because sometimes, as in that example, the compound noun gets split up. So we might say, do you fancy going swimming? They've opened a new pool in the village, whatever. The swimming pool gets split up in some ways. So they're both present, but they're not actually how the words used once we give an example. Again, some of these things, they might, they don't immediately come to mind. We can think of one, maybe two, maybe there are more that we could think of, better examples. I think if we either think about it beforehand or after the event, it's kind of saying, oh God, why couldn't I think why it was, what was it, reconstruct a crime, for example. Everybody, it happens to everybody. You just can't think it. It's happening to me now. You can't think of it at that moment, and unless you've kind of primed yourself to be able to think about it. So it's spending a little bit more time on this, and for me a little less time on the kind of activities, if you like. Questions here. These are ones which are based on the ones we've had, some of the words we've had so far. But these are the kinds of questions. Unfortunately, I don't have time. I'm doing a talk about questions at IATEFL, if anybody's interested, and we'll be there. But it's thinking about the kind of questions we ask about vocabulary. So the idea with these questions is what they are generating is language which may be connected, not necessarily direct collocation, sorry, but the usage of how these words are. So, for example, the first one, what rules do you have around a swimming pool? Okay, it's not the best question, but don't run, wear your flip-flops, make sure you wear a hat in the swimming hats. So I can't even remember the name of the swimming hat thing. They kind of, everybody knows what the rules are, but they might not know the language. So it's kind of generating the language around the words you're teaching. And if you imagine if you were telling a story, perhaps, or saying something that happened down there, an accident or whatever, some of these words may come up. And obviously they're recycling other language as well. So you get this kind of, they're richer, language-rich questions, if you like. What might you ask if someone's carrying a lot of gear? I mean, gear is in fishing gear and that kind of thing here. That would be, you'd say, "Can I help you?" Hopefully, can you manage all of that stuff? Something like this. So there's thinking about how that word. It's not only getting you thinking about how the word's used in conversation, but also obviously encouraging the students to think about language in the same way. Again, these questions, to think of them on the spot is quite tricky, especially for something like swimming pool or fishing gear. I mean, it's quite difficult. I mean, I'm not saying these are the best questions, but you kind of have to think about them beforehand to be able to ask them on the spot. The idea here might be, if in terms of your own development, maybe you can use the sentence stems, a lot of them. What might you ask if could be used for lots of kind of collocations and phrases, etc. Okay, sentences coming near into the end. I have to be sharpen up a bit, so I took too long as usual. Here, again, these are not necessarily, I'm not saying that these are so much more common than he has a beard or she is a Christian. But what I think is interesting is they are a little bit more common, but also they show more of how language works. They're giving examples to students where they're seeing more grammar. Part of the problem with that X is Y all the time, as an example, is the students only see the X is Y, rather than the kind of more complex sentences which they have to produce in the long term. So here, just of those examples, can you see any traditional grammar you could ask about, any useful chunks you could show? What variations could you give for those chunks? What might be said before and after? Don't know how much time we have. James, tell me. Okay. So, God, I will give a bit of some examples there. You see, I mean, probably you will have seen the who was the guy with blonde hair, who was the guy with the big leather jacket, who was the guy with the pink tie, perhaps. You know, we can. Who was the guy sitting next to you? Who was the guy opposite you? So sometimes by having these kinds of sentences, we show a different kind of lexical set. Sometimes the lexical set is a bit more restricted than we might have in other examples. I believe you might have seen the there's a thing I wrote on the BELTA website about lexical sets, which may refer to this. We could obviously give replies, etc. With this one, for me, I might actually draw attention to the past perfect. So why do we use had stopped? Why not just stopped beating? So through vocabulary, we can ask simple little quick questions to revise elements of grammar. So in this case, obviously, had stopped because it happened before they arrived, because they then had to get it going again. We might think of any other things that we can get going again. So maybe you know, get the engine going again. So you know, my car stopped, but my dad got it going again. But the AA got it going again. My boiler broke down recently, so I had to call out somebody to get it going again. Rushed. Why might we rush someone to hospital? So we might ask, you know, because they're dying, then it's an emergency. Again, these are words which they're questions which generate vocabulary and check meaning. Any other places we might rush to, perhaps you might ask something on those lines. Obviously here we've got things like, you know, well, as a language teacher, as a believer in a more lexical approach, I think we should spend more time on focusing on language. There's a kind of pattern which can be generated and used for lots of situations. You could see quite easily practiced for you know, maybe starting off with religions, but it could be talking about, you know, we could replace Christian in this kind of frame with parent, teacher, all kinds of other viewpoints. And you know, how often do we see this kind of pattern taught? My feeling is within a course book. I mean, I don't remember seeing it taught in a course book ever. Yet it's quite a useful and interesting little pattern which students could use. So, but you won't notice that unless you look for it either within the texts of course books, or you've thought about the example before, and it's quite difficult to think about it on the spot. But once you have thought about it, once you have planned for it within, say, the context of a course where it came up in a reading or a listening, it makes it available for us to do when a student asks, what does Muslim mean, or whatever, or what does Islam mean? Okay. We have the link here is basically to our website. We have a little series running. We're interested if anybody wants to suggest ideas of exercises, basically taking short exercises from the course book, maybe vocabulary or grammar, and thinking about how we might exploit them in a slightly more language-rich, lexical way. All you have to do is to send in the completed exercise, a little bit like we had earlier, like this one. like this one. This is obviously the completed answers. You send that in, and we suggest either questions you might do, or notice chunks, or invite other people to comment as well. So if anybody's interested, please do that. And then last, very briefly, I'll just mention this because we are kind of running late, is thinking about, you could just thinking more about what the students might want to say in the speaking exercises that exist in a course book, or which you've set them. So, you know, it may mean either doing it yourself and writing down what you might say. You might do it with a partner. So, I mean, this kind of thing you could do in a school, perhaps getting different teachers to write or record their answers, and then just noticing the language which is repeated or could be useful for the students to do the task. Because often there's a disconnect between say usually is a grammar practice or some single word practice, and then the task which we set, which requires a much more complex use of language and may include a variety of things which we haven't thought of before. And then I think we're coming to the end. So our last thing, here are some possible ongoing questions we might ask. So my idea here is, what did I learn about my students today? If we can't answer this question, it seems to me that maybe we're not necessarily having enough interaction, real interaction with students, or between students, where they actually talk about themselves and about what they think. And that has an implication about the kind of language which we end up teaching them. What new language did they learn? To me, is a fundamental question we should always be asking, because if it's only present perfect, I feel that that's probably not really new to a lot of students. And often the words even that we teach are often known to them. So is it a new combinations which we're teaching, or is it new phrases around those words? So the good thing about those questions we looked at earlier is often the students know the answer from their own language, from what a swimming pool is and the kinds of rules around them. It's just they don't know how to say run or slip or these kinds of words. Were there any better questions? So yeah, we can't plan for everything, but the point is we should be thinking in terms of the language of what I taught and whether I could have given a better example or asked better questions after the event, and helping us, because often it may be the same class which we do, that, you know, it should be the same material that we do in the next class, so that we can bring that to bear and get better at doing what we're doing. What questions did my students ask? Again, if they don't ask anything, are we giving them enough opportunity to show what they know and to give us information about what they know and don't know about language? And then again, reflecting about how I did them. The last one is just a thought for anybody. I think we do get better at dealing with language if we think more about, if we write material. You know, ideally get somebody to have a look at it and edit it for you, do it in pairs, work together on something. But it's been trying to teach it, being critical about ourselves. When would I say it? Why would I say it? Thinking about language in use and how the students might want to use it. And I think we are more or less finished, other than to say that point. I think it's in a way, being able to answer language questions, being able to ask questions and give examples about words and collocations is not a natural thing, actually. And it's a little bit like relearning the language. And so, you know, it is an ongoing process along with your students, and practice will make it a lot better. But that has to be the focus of practice. it's a little bit like you know, the language learning, where the student just learns lists of words but never tries practicing using them. And I think sometimes we do the same. We maybe only give the meanings of words, we only replay previous classes rather than trying to progress and put into action new areas of language that we might teach. And by consequence, you know, it never really stops, which is a good thing or depressing, however you like to take it. I think it's a good thing. It means there's always something interesting new around the corner as a teacher. And that's it. Any questions? I have one at the bottom here, which we had was frequency and context. I think I answered that as earlier. There was somebody mentioned about, are we still there? There was somebody asked about blonde being more, was it blonde or banana being more common if it was more balanced to speaking. I think that is probably true. I mean, it's bound to be true. You know, in my household, we often will go, can you buy some bananas? It's generally in one phrase though. And in the rest, it's easy for that phrase to take on, because it's easily remembered and it's an easy moment, to think that it's a useful, it's more frequent and more useful than the word arise, for example. Whereas arise, as I say, may be used in many other contexts, in the reading that they're doing in their schoolwork, in newspapers, in the news bulletins they listen to. If you think about that, it's thinking about the wider context of language use. Speaking is vital, and that's what students, I mean, I still believe, come to class for, but we need to still think about how their language might work outside. And for many of them, maybe banana they will never use in their own context, because they go to the shop in their own country and they have no requirements to ask other people in English to buy them bananas or eat bananas. Dan Comfort. Okay. Can I see this? Let me have a look. James, can you? I can't see the whole question there. Says you've talked about teachers giving further examples, dialogues. I just not.
Do you think it will expand?
Yeah. I can't. Yeah, sorry. There's another one which comes up. I can't see. Do you think there's a danger that lessons become very teacher-centered as a result? How do you think teachers can avoid this? My first thought about this is that talking about language and giving good examples is student-centered. It's the teacher saying them, but it's what the students want to say and need to hear in order to be able to say them better, those words. So in a way, for me, teacher-centeredness is not to do with teacher talking and students, or rather than students talking. It's to do with whether it's talk for the teacher's benefit or for the student's benefit. So that would be my first point. Yes, there is a danger that you could then just give lectures, which we want to avoid. And I think that's where the questions, those kind of questions that we looked at briefly, I know we didn't have a lot of time for them, are very useful, because you give the quick example. Ideally, we would have more material with sentences rather than single words, so they would have more of the examples already. But by asking the questions, it's the students giving the answer. Yeah, you've given the meaning. You might give a quick translation, or you know, and a quick example. Then you ask that question, and those kind of questions will often be slightly open. They're not yes/no questions. They're asking about the more general language around them. So thank you, whoever's brought those up. So not these ones actually. Let's have a look. It's yeah, these kind of things. These kind of questions, they're generating language, what things can you rebuild? They're generating other language, so they're kind of interesting to do. And often what you will find is students will make jokes often in the same way that teachers do. I mean, they could be quite cruel about why one would reconstruct someone's face, I imagine. But obviously the real reason would be that somebody's had an accident, or they had some, you know, maybe, you know, some congenital problem, for example, where they need an operation. These might not be the things we'd be able to say. Similarly, that people would joke about, what would you say, somebody carrying a lot of gear? They might kind of just say, shouldn't have bought so much. These kind of things. So what you'll find is there is some kind of student interaction, quite interesting, which is going on there. And then obviously after all of this, we would be giving practice, and the simplest practice is getting them maybe asking questions about the vocabulary where they would talk about them in some way, tell their own stories, yeah, give their own examples, that kind of thing. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Okay. So thanks very much, Andrew. That was really interesting. Really enjoyed that a lot. And thanks to everyone who's come to the webinar today. Soon we'll be opening the registration for this year's BELTA Day, which is on the 25th of April, where we'll be joined by Andrew's colleague Hugh Deller. So keep your eyes peeled on our website, Facebook page, and on Twitter to find out more. That's coming very soon. Our next Sunday with BELTA is on the 8th of March with Divya Madhavan, who'll be giving us a step-by-step description of what an action research project looks like in her presentation, Action Research, What Yours Might Look Like. And if I can just mention that BELTA is going to be doing a series of special webinars in support of the TEFL Equity Advocates campaign. And the first webinar is going to be on the 22nd of February, so in a couple of weeks. And that's going to be presented by me. So if you'd like to come, I'd appreciate that very much. And we look forward to seeing you on the 8th of March with Divya. So thanks very much for coming, everybody. And
thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye.